Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's well. My name is David Anderson, and I am the program lead for the Healthy Landscapes program. And this is the webinar Wednesdays that we run about 4 times a year with different research results. And helping us out today is Terry McHugh behind the scenes, and you'll be hearing more from Terry later from FRI Research. The operations manager and the lead for the Knowledge Network. And today we have Dr. Cameron Nafisi presenting, and his title slide you should be seeing now on fire severity mediated dynamics of the Southwestern Alberta Foothills. Cameron did his PhD in University of Colorado with Tom Veblen, and has been worked as a postdoc with Laurie Daniels at UBC, where he did this part of the work right now. And right now, Cameron is at Oregon State University. So the rules of the next hour or so are, I will finish talking and hand it over to Cameron, and you can at least see what he looks like now. I'll turn my camera off. Cameron will turn his camera off, and you can focus on the presentation. We have we've turned off all the microphones, and when at the end of the presentation for the question and answer period, you can either put your hand up. There's a place to do that on your dashboard, and Terry will unmute your mic and you can speak directly with Cameron. Or if you would prefer, you can type your question in the question box if you'd like. We will be recording the presentation, but not the Q&A. And then we'll make that link available to anyone who wishes, and you can pass it around to others. So without further ado, I will turn my camera and mic off and hand it over to Cameron.
All right, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Terry, as well. I'll go ahead and turn my camera off and jump into the presentation. Thanks everyone for tuning in as well, and for FRI Research for hosting me. I'm looking forward to it. So I'll be talking about work that we've been working on now for the last several years. It's been a pretty interesting project with a lot of different pieces. I want to start by just talking and giving a little bit of background about our motivations going into this research, why the project was formed, what kind of lens we were using to sort of craft the research and the ideas that have come out of it. There were really 2 major motivations. One was understanding better the geography and dynamics of mixed-severity fire regimes in the southeastern Alberta Foothills region, and I'll give you some background on why we were interested in that in a second. And second was really, once we began to dig into this ecosystem and understand it, get our feet on the ground, it became apparent pretty early on that this was a really interesting case study for a broader conversation about the sensitivity of certain forest ecosystems to increases in fire frequency driven by climate change. And I'll also detail some of our thinking on the framework. In the southwestern Alberta Foothills, this idea of mixed-severity fire regimes has become of increasing interest over recent years. When I talk about mixed-severity fire regimes, I'll leave this at a fairly basic definition for now, and you'll see, I think, operationally and ecologically what I mean by it for this particular ecosystem. But basically, mixed-severity fire regimes are those that exhibit spatial and temporal variability of fire severity, right? And the interesting thing about mixed-severity fire regimes and the conversation that they've instilled in the broader community is that it really forces us to think about fire regimes as a gradient rather than this black and white view of low severity fire regimes, high severity fire regimes. There's all this gray area in the middle, and thinking about mixed severity fire regimes really causes us to have to focus in on that and think about what it is that we mean there. Think about how we characterize these regimes, and that's really a big part of what we've been doing for this project. The motivation for thinking about mixed-severity fire regimes in the Alberta Foothills really comes from 2 studies listed here, Amoroso et al. In 2011 and Chafardes and Daniels in 2016, that were essentially case studies in individual areas, not very large areas, where they really tried to dig into the ecology of these areas and understand whether these mixed severity fire regimes were operating or whether these were largely high severity fire regimes, which was the kind of standard model that had been used in these areas. And they did find evidence for mixed severity fire regimes in both of these cases. But the larger set of questions that came out of this, because these were case studies, is, well, how widespread are these mixed severity fire regimes? Do we only find them in these cases, but they're not necessarily a part of the larger landscape? Where do they occur in the landscape? Those sorts of geographical questions began to come to the forefront. Secondarily, well, what do we mean by mixed severity fire regimes? What are the ecological dynamics that characterize these ecosystems? And then very much related to that, because of the framework of ecosystem-based management that is important currently, what are the management implications of these mixed severity fire regimes? How do we understand them in the context of current management paradigms, or ones that we should be considering? So this was the kind of one of the major sets of motivating conversations that was going on at the onset of this project. And the second one, related to fire sensitive ecosystems, comes from, in large part, or at least one of the best examples of it, is work that's come out of the Yellowstone area by Monica Turner and Anthony Westerling and others. There have been multiple papers now that have focused on what they show here in this graphic, which is comes from fire climate models that they've developed in Yellowstone in vegetation types that are very similar to those actually of the Alberta foothills. So lodgepole pine dominated ecosystems with spruce fir at higher elevations and Douglas-fir at lower elevations, aspen thrown into the mix. And what they've found there is in their modeling is that these extreme events like the 1988 fire in Yellowstone are likely to increase in frequency over time. And what this has led them to sort of speculate about, and what they've done a really good job in framing, is what will happen to these ecosystems under that sort of climate forcing of increased fire frequency. Are there these points at which ecosystems may collapse or shift to very different dynamics or landscape conditions? This is one of their model outputs, just showing how fire rotation, or the inverse of fire frequency, is likely to evolve over 4 different time periods. And you can see that you get this shortening of fire return intervals over time to very short intervals in the mid 21st century. So looking at less than 50-year fire intervals as predicted by their models. And this is what has caused them to think that we might see some very widespread either ecosystem collapse or at least major transformations in these ecosystems. And in reading these papers, I think one of the clear things that's missing, one of the things that's so fundamental to understanding how climate forcing of fire frequency may unfold and how it may impact ecosystems, is accounting for especially vegetation fire feedbacks. We know that these feedback mechanisms are really what's going to dictate the ultimate sort of outcomes and behaviors that we see. And that's where we've needed to do a lot of work. And because the Alberta foothills have such strong parallels with the ecosystem of Yellowstone and that general set of ideas about fire sensitive systems in the face of climate change, this became one of our major motivating factors. So here's some specific objectives for our study. One is, that I won't talk about too much today, other than very briefly, was to really work on developing ways of improving how we talk about, how we characterize, and how we quantify fire severity. It's a really challenging problem. I'll highlight just a little bit about that, but I won't dig into some of the technical details there. The other one was just characterizing the basic geographic patterns of fire regimes and fire regime variability within forests of the southern Alberta foothills. The third was to understand what these mixed severity fire regimes meant in this particular context, right? If we're seeing mixed severity fire regime dynamics, what does that look like? What does that mean for this particular ecosystem? And fourth, try and use this ecosystem to help inform the broader conversation about how ecosystems may respond to frequent fire, especially those that are thought to have had predominantly high severity fire regimes and longer fire intervals in particular. So some brief background on our study area. You can see here our study area essentially extended from the US border north to about Highway 1, from the Continental Divide here on the east side down to the grasslands. So these lower ecosystems here or these lower ecoregions here are grassland types that blend into the montane ecosystem, this thin strip that characterizes the Front Range and then grades into subalpine forest. We spent a lot of our time working in this montane to lower subalpine zone. These colored polygons here are sample polygons, and this crosshatched area shows the general range of Douglas-fir within the area. So within the montane zone, I'll be talking throughout the presentation about the Douglas-fir zone, which is this kind of southern portion of the montane predominantly, versus the lodgepole pine portion of the montane zone, which characterizes essentially all of the north and then portions of the south as well. This just shows some of the ways that the detailed sample design that we use, combining fire scars and age structure plots nested within these patches that were distributed across important biophysical gradients within the study area. I'm going to be talking a lot of the analyses, and the results that I'll be showing you will be binned by these general vegetation types. So pure Douglas-fir forest, these are organized kind of from the drier to the moister settings. Pure Douglas-fir forests, dry mixed conifer, Douglas-fir dominated forests. These are similar to Douglas-fir forests, but they tend to have a mix of aspen, sometimes lodgepole pine mixed in with them as well. Moist mixed conifer forests, these are the most diverse forests. They oftentimes weren't dominated by an individual species, or at least it was highly variable. Spruce, lodgepole pine, aspen were all components of these moist mixed conifer forests. Then the pure lodgepole pine forest, which represents the largest, sort of the largest category of forest expanse within the area that we were studying. Pure aspen forests, mixed wood forests, which were generally a mix of lodgepole and aspen, and then spruce forest, which was a mix of Engelmann and white spruce oftentimes. So this is the set of forest cover types that I'll be talking about today. A brief note on how we were characterizing fire severity. There's a lot going on in this graphic, but really what I want to draw your attention to is this problem of the fading record in paleoecology more generally, and dendroecology specifically. This is a well-known phenomenon with paleoecological records where, as we go back in time, we oftentimes are missing sort of more and more evidence, and this can have important impacts on the inferences that we make. In many cases, such as you can see in the upper panel, panel A here, or panel B here, for climate reconstructions or fire history reconstructions, one of the major impacts that this has on the data and on the analyses that we do subsequently is it limits the sample size, especially as we go back through time. And at some point, usually we feel that the record is no longer robust. And so oftentimes data analyses and interpretations are kind of truncated there. And in these right-hand graphics, you can see the red portion of the data is sort of that portion of the data that gets truncated or sort of is uncertain. When we're thinking about reconstructing fire severity, it's a very different case, and it's actually a much more wicked problem. And the reason for that is because the very behavior that we're interested in understanding, which is fire severity, is actually related to the degree of missing evidence that exists in our records. And so these two things, our data and the behaviors, are fundamentally intertwined, right? If you think about the impacts of a high severity fire, where we want to document, say, a high severity fire, well, all evidence of the previous stand is actually erased. And so all we have is the most recent evidence. And you can see the influence of this intertwining of the evidence means that we very quickly begin to lose evidence, and that creates a lot of noise in the potential interpretations that we can make. So I won't talk too much about the technical details other than to leave that context there and then tell you about some specific metrics that we did use. The basic set of metrics that we used are based on this relationship between the density of surviving trees versus the number of fires that has occurred in a point in the landscape. And so these D0 through D4 represent multiple or different fire events as we go back through time, and the amount of density of survivors that occurs with each event. So this D0 is the current density, that's the density that stands right now. And we have 3 severity related metrics. The first is this event level severity, and it tells us for any given event, the change between one fire and the other. The metric essentially works such that severity is proportional to that change. So if you have a bigger drop in density, that's because it was a more severe fire. There's a lot of details here, again, that I won't talk about, but this is the general meaning of this delta SN metric that I'll be talking about today. So that delta SN is the event level severity metric. And we can also just look for an individual site over time, how quickly density drops, and we can fit a linear function to that. And the slope of that linear function is related to the time integrated, the cumulative severity of all events over time at that site. And so this is a really useful way of just saying over time at this site, this was sort of the average severity that occurred. And then finally, we've developed something called the stand replacing equivalent, which is essentially a turnover rate. How long did it take? How many events or how many years did it take for the stand to replace itself, right, to reach the equivalent of high severity fire? So these are the 3 metrics I'll be talking about today: the event level severity metric, the time integrated severity, and the stand replacing equivalent. So I'm going to just jump right into some results about the fire regime in the foothills. First off, these are fire demography charts for each of our study areas. EBW is the Elbow River, SHP is Sheep River, OMW is Old Man West, this is around Livingston Gap. Old Man East, this is the Bob Creek Wildland nearby. And Old Man North is just a bit north of that. And then Porcupine Hills North. Those were our 6 study areas. Elbow, Sheep River, and Old Man West were all part of the lodgepole pine zone within the study area, whereas the other 3 were part of the Douglas-fir zone. So I've got them kind of split up in those ways. And the main things to notice here are the length of our records. So in the lodgepole pine zone, our records were pretty good back until the 1800s. They did extend back into the 1700s in many cases, but the record becomes increasingly spotty. The other thing to notice here, I guess background on these charts is each of these lines is one of our study sites or a study patch. Each of the small vertical lines here are fire events. The triangles are age cohorts, so sort of major pulses of tree regeneration. And so you can see that fire was actually quite frequent in these ecosystems, including the lodgepole pine forest. And I'll talk quite a lot about that. I think this is a really important finding for this area. It's one that's been documented previously, but it has very strong bearing on the rest of the results that I'll present, including some very short intervals in some cases. It's fairly frequent, and it's fairly consistently frequent fire. For the Douglas-fir zone, we had really extensive records, and they went back as far as the 14 or 1500s, although most of the data was pretty robust through the 1700s. Very frequent fire in these ecosystems, more frequent actually than I've seen in Douglas-fir forests and similar Douglas-fir forests in other regions. And the overall take-home of the patterns of fire frequency in this area is that across all of these forest types, fire was very frequent, and in particular was very frequent for lodgepole pine forests, which are classically thought to have had longer fire return intervals, oftentimes on the order of hundreds to hundreds of years. So here you can see median fire intervals for each of these different vegetation types: Douglas-fir, dry mixed conifer, Douglas-fir, lodgepole pine, aspen, mixed wood, moist mixed conifer, and spruce types. The other pattern that jumped out, especially for the lodgepole pine forest, is the interval between the pith, which is the center of each tree, and the fir scar. And we saw this pattern frequently in the field, where the first scar recorded on a tree was oftentimes recorded within the first 20 to 40 years of the tree's lives. So fires were happening not only frequently, but the result of that was that they were happening in young forest. and still leaving some survivors. So this is the kind of evidence that we found in the field and in the lab as we began to look into the records that we collected. When we look at the outcomes of fire severity for these ecosystems, what I'm showing you here in these graphics are each of these same forest types and the delta SN metrics. So the way to read this is that more negative values are lower severity and more positive values are higher severity. And I've color coded them: red for high severity, orange for moderate severity, and yellow for low severity, based on thresholding of that delta SN metric. And above each of these bar graphs and the probability density distribution that's fit to them, I've just placed a box plot so you can see a little bit where the distribution is and where the median lies. So the take-home point here are several-fold. Douglas-fir, I guess the main take-home message is that there was highly variable fire severity really across all forest types within the montane and lower subalpine zone of the Alberta foothills. For Douglas-fir forest, the regime that emerges from these data is one of predominantly low and a lot of moderate severity fire, but also this important sort of tail of high severity events. So low and moderate severity fires dominated, but there was some high severity fire as well. For the dry mixed conifer Douglas-fir forest, a fairly different pattern. High severity fire was a much more important part of those of the disturbance history of those sites, and it was mixed over time with some of these lower and moderate severity fires. Lodgepole pine overall was affected by, it was also a mixed severity fire regime, but it was characterized by a very different distribution of severities, much more skewed towards higher severity. But there was this important component: about 30% of our sample points recorded low to moderate severity impacts. And for the rest of these forest types, a real mix. All of them experience a mix of basically all the different severities. And one of the things that we did then was characterize the fire regime space of each of these forest types in this multivariate space defined by severity. We used the cumulative severity metric on the x-axis there, and on the y-axis, just the median fire interval. These are two of the major tiers of sort of the fire regime, are the severity and frequency. And because we have quantitative metrics now, we can characterize both of these. And here's how you see where the different forest types fall out in that space. One of the things I'll point out is that in general, there's greater variability of severity than there is frequency within each of these different forest types. Douglas-fir, you can see here, had very frequent fire. And oh, and one other thing I should mention, these dashed lines represent sort of useful breakpoints in fire severity, the 30th and 80th percentile values. So below this line would be predominantly lower severity regimes, mixed severity in the middle here, and then high severity to the right of this line. And you can see where each of them fall out with respect to those thresholds. So Douglas-fir is kind of right at that boundary. It's frequent fire and it's a lower severity model, but not a low severity model. It's really just, it's a mixed severity fire regime model that tends towards that lower side. And this is different from what we've seen actually for these pure Douglas-fir forests and other areas where there's slightly higher fire intervals and more severe effects overall. And lodgepole pine here in yellow, again, is mixed severity, but it's really towards the higher end of this gradient. And here's how it might compare to, say, a classic model, right, where we've got severe fire that happens infrequently on the order of 100 to several hundreds of years. So in both cases, I would say within the Alberta foothills, there's both more frequent and more diverse fire regimes than have been recorded for these same forest types elsewhere. And when we think about these general zones, the Douglas-fir zone, which is dominated by Douglas-fir, but also has components of moist mixed conifer, aspen forest, mixed wood, and dry mixed conifer forest, you can begin to see how these forest types intermix and what their relative severity patterns are. So in the Douglas-fir zone, you can see that there's contrasting regimes between the pure Douglas-fir forests, which represent the majority of forest area, and the other forest types that it's intermixed with. For the lodgepole pine zone, you can see much less differences between the intermixing of forest types. So they tend to have a similar pattern of both frequency and severity. And these influences, both the vegetation and also biophysical setting, are sort of represented here for individual study areas, and show in the relative location of each of these study areas within fire regime space. So we can see, for instance, the Porcupine Hills North, which had quite a lot of a mix of Douglas-fir, dry mixed conifer, and moist mixed conifer forest, that it actually is skewed more towards a more mixed severity regime than Bob Creek wildland, for instance, which was on the drier end of the spectrum and was mostly pure Douglas-fir forest and limber pine. Similarly, for the lodgepole pine forest, OMW was sort of our furthest west, our highest elevation drainage, and experienced both less frequent fire and somewhat more severe fire. So this is a useful way, looking at both individual sites or forest types or study areas within this fire regime space is a really useful way to begin to understand where the differences in the fire regime are occurring. These graphics show, again, the same set of forest types, and they show the stand replacing equivalent in terms of years and in terms of events. And what we see here for lodgepole pine is that they tended to self-replace, or they tended to sort of turn over fully about every 20 to 40 years, and about really every 2 to 3 events, mostly 2 events. So essentially, the mixed-severity fire regime in this lodgepole pine forest was mixed. There was some trees that were surviving, but they tended not to survive more than 2 fires, and that usually played out on the order of every 20 to 40 years. Once in a while, 3 or more fires. Douglas-fir, on the other hand, had much longer stand replacing equivalents in terms of years, on the order of hundreds of years, and upwards between sort of 7 to 10 events on average. So these were surviving many, many fires that were happening with short intervals, generally, based on the previous data I showed you. So what was the outcomes of this fire regime that I just described for the landscape, for the landscape character of both of these forest zones that we've been talking about and the different forest types? Well, at the onset of fire exclusion in about 1940, after the last set of major fires in the area, the lodgepole pine zone was dominated by very young forests. You can look at the distribution of stand ages from all of our data for each of these different data types. And you can see lodgepole pine forests here, the median value was right around 25 to 35 years. Very young forest over a very large area as well. If you compare that or contrast that with Douglas-fir, you can see, again, quite a lot of variability actually in Douglas-fir, suggesting that there were both some very old stands as well as some very young stands, and quite a range in between. So highly variable age structures in Douglas-fir forest, somewhat intermediate in the dry mixed conifer Douglas-fir forest, and for the rest of these, very young stand ages. This graphic here shows the percent of different patches that were recording individual fire events over time, and then the age structural patterns aggregated across all patches for the lodgepole pine zone here in yellow and for the Douglas-fir zone here in brown. And you can see, again, a lot of these, the aggregate distribution of lodgepole pine ages was quite young and coincided with the last set of major fires, not the last one, but the last few. With a very weak tail that goes back to older fires, whereas Douglas-fir has a much more pronounced tail. And you can also see here in these inset graphics, these show the percent of patches that recorded each cohort. And what you can see here is that there were very few patches were recording the same cohort. And so what this means is that in the lodgepole pine zone, we had young forest, but the stand ages of adjacent patches were not the same, right? These had either arisen from different events or they had different age structural characteristics. resulting from the different timing and effects of fire. So it was young, but it was heterogeneous. We did some ordination based on the age, structural, and compositional characteristics of these patches. I won't get into those details, but the cluster analysis and ordination essentially showed that there was simple stands. These are sort of young, even age stands in the red here, intermediate complexity stands in green, and more complex stands in blue in terms of the number of cohorts they had. Here's some examples here. So this simple is sort of the classic lodgepole pine, young, or an even age stand, could be young or old. Intermediate complexity stands, these were oftentimes just double cohort stands that had survived one fire after being initiated by high severity fire. And then more complex stands that had multiple cohorts and tended to have more frequent fire as well. And so if we look at the distribution of these age structural complexity classes across the different forest types that we've been talking about, what you see in Douglas-fir is it was really evenly dominated by complex and intermediate complexity stands or patches. Whereas lodgepole pine, because of the importance of high severity fire in these ecosystems and the prominence of high severity fire, had quite a lot of even age, simple structures, but mixed in with some of these intermediate and some complex structures as well. And this is just some visuals, images taken from the Mountain Legacy Project, showing what this landscape looked like to the naked eye at around the same time that our data comes from. I found these photos really interesting, quite beautiful, and also there's a real convergence of the data sets and what the inferences we make from all the data that I've just shown you and what you can read into these landscapes here. Looking at these photos, you can see things like a young aspen stand here that was young, just the same as this sort of in the middle foreground here, relatively young aspen stand that was then burned here. You can see the burned tops of some of the snags that remain or were partially consumed here. So you've got two aspen cohorts, both of them very young, right next to each other, sort of sparse lodgepole pine scattered around, having survived some of these fires. This is sort of the mixed severity component of these ecosystems. I'll go through and show you a couple of these to emphasize the patterns and the scale of some of these patterns. I mean, again, thinking about my conclusion that young forests were very widespread over very large areas. We can see it here in these photos. This is again, this 20 to 40-year-old lodgepole pine forest and aspen forest over a very large area. Again, the same pattern here. You can see a recent fire. I think this was probably a 1929 fire near the Sheep River area that burned through in a patchy manner. But also what it was burning through, again, was this young lodgepole pine forest. So you see this the spatial complexity of both very young age cohorts in close association. Again, here you can see the pattern of some of these old fires sort of creeping around and creating a more complex pattern, spatial pattern of burn in what we might assume is a very vulnerable stage in a very vulnerable forest type, both aspen and lodgepole pine, not thought to be very fire resistant at this age. This is a picture from the Bridgeland survey in 1913 of near the Old Man River. And what you're seeing here actually is multiple photos that we've stitched together in an area where we have records of fires in 1910, 1869, 1856, and 1831. You can clearly see the fire scar of the 1910 fire here with some island remnants being left. And again, this same pattern of young lodgepole pine forest being burned out by a subsequent fire, and in some cases leaving patches behind. One thing I wanted to point out with a lot of these old images, and we don't have data to speak to this, but it's the sort of lack of large snags following fire that existed in this landscape. It's apparent in a lot of these photos. If we go back and look at some of the other ones that I just showed you, you can see this in many cases. But because the forest that was being replaced when it was burned at high severity, or even when it was burned at lower severities, was generally a young forest, you can see in some cases snags that are standing, but they're fairly small stature and not very large. And in many cases, there's almost a paucity of large woody material being left behind in these ecosystems. And I think this is a real contrast with what we come to expect from post-fire environments in lodgepole pine forests, with longer fire intervals based on this sort of classic model, or even reburns in modern lodgepole pine fires, just because there's been this legacy of fire exclusion now. And so a lot of this lodgepole pine forest has grown up. And I want to just bring this full circle to talk about what I think are kind of two types of fire regimes that we found within the lodgepole pine zone. On the upper panels here, you can see an example of this. These were really interesting, spatially heterogeneous landscapes where we had both intermixing of both even-aged and uneven-aged stands, all of it really quite young. A very heavy aspen distribution. You can see that in these graphics here. So from this very landscape that you're looking at here, this is some of our data, and you can see relatively frequent fire. You can see multiple cohorts in many of these systems, some of them not very strong, multiple cohorts. So this is kind of one type of dynamic that we saw, especially on the lower montane sites. And as we move back a little bit further into the montane, this is the Old Man area here. The regime was a little bit different. Fire tended not to be quite as frequent, still fairly frequent for this ecosystem type. Aspen was not as large of a component, although it was still in some of these stands. And the scale of the fire severity patterns was a little bit coarser. So you can see some of these large areas that were blown out. You can see some patches that were left behind, some sort of mixed severity stands, salt and peppered around as well. But not as much multi-cohort component, more even-aged, coarser scale disturbance regime. And so these are two kind of subtle varieties of disturbance regimes that appear within our records in the lodgepole pine zone. And if we turn now to the Douglas-fir forests, this is an aerial photo from the 1940s that shows this large area that was blown out, high severity fire immediately adjacent to much more sort of complex forest structures. This is a close-up of the inset here, and then these labels correspond to photos that we took in these different areas. So you can see, for instance, in A and D here, this area that was part of this really large high severity patch is now growing back in very dense, predominantly Douglas fir, sometimes lodgepole pine. Interestingly, in the middle of some of this, we oftentimes saw forest structures that were suggestive or that clearly came from stands that had experienced multiple low severity, moderate severity fires, and had very old forest tree structures that were just blown out by some of these events. I think this was the 1919 fire in this case. We also see other areas of patches, of usually smaller patches of really old forest, such as in B here. Individual trees, very old trees in otherwise grasslandy or younger aged forests. And then as an F here, some of these really open, young savanna style or sort of Douglas fir woodlands. You can see some of the age structures here that appear from that as well. This is A and D show high severity impacts here. E shows some of these intermediate age stands. C, again, are some of these woodlands. And then E are some of these, or B are some of these old growth, really beautiful Douglas fir stands that have experienced a lot of fire in predominantly lower severity regimes. So we think of some of there's some larger tales about the dynamics of these ecosystems and the influence of frequent fire in them that I want to draw attention to. One is, this is modeling work that isn't fully done yet, but we're really interested in understanding how the ecosystems responded to changes in fire frequency and whether there might be tipping points. And what we found so far, this is still preliminary, is that there is a consistent signal in these ecosystems where, as median fire intervals decreased, we see this really strong threshold response around 30 to 50 year median fire intervals, both in terms of fire severity. So these plots represent sort of these are partial dependence plots. And so they represent essentially the probability of something happening across your gradient of interest. So we see as we get down below about 50, fire severity decreases, the sort of fire regime class, mixed severity fire regimes become more prominent, high severity fire regimes decrease, and we get a decrease in even age stands, an increase in intermediate age stands, and actually this kind of bimodal distribution of complex stands. I think this is because where we have older stands, they're actually quite complex, in some ways more complex even than these young stands that have experienced intermediate severities. So a very consistent threshold point around the 50-year mark for each of these attributes of the fire regime. This graphic just shows the most widespread fire years in the region, and really what I want you to see here is just the variability, especially between lodgepole pine and Douglas-fir. Douglas-fir tended, even in many of these very large fire years, to experience relatively low fire severity effects. There are some exceptions. 1869 seems to have been a particularly severe year. But many of these, and 1748, actually 1748 is the most widespread fire year in Western North America, which we recorded from Canada all the way down near to Mexico. Lodgepole pine had many years where it was predominantly high severity, but there were some years, including major fires such as 1910, where there was quite a range of variability, even though the median tends to fall within the higher severity. And this is, again, mountain legacy imagery, just showing the change that can occur in an area over a relatively short time period. I show this just to emphasize the dynamism and the transitory character of these landscapes. Above is 1895, picture taken in 1895, and below one taken in 1940. This is the same landscape. These arrows point to the same locations within each of these photos. And what we've been able to do by pairing our dendroecological evidence with these mountain legacy imagery and analyses that they've been doing to characterize land cover, which is seen here, is to look at change in between each of these surveys and in relation to some of the major fire years. So you can see conifer here in green largely is shifted over this 45-year period from a predominantly conifer forest to one that is dominated by recent burns, herbaceous and shrubland, and more aspen, a greater aspen component. What we know about the fire history from our data leading up to this 1895 survey was that there were fires in 1800, 1843, and 1863, followed by a bit of a hiatus in fires, and then a short interval event in between the 1919 and 1929 fires that really transformed this landscape. And here I'm showing this same area now, just including a greater number of image pairs, which are the gray triangles here. And from 3 surveys that we have in this area, whoops, you can see in 1895, 1916, and 1940, some of the visual transitions that were going on, and now we're actually able to quantify this. And you can see that in between 1895 and 1916, where there were really no major fire events in the area that we have documentation for, at least, this landscape was sort of increasingly becoming dominated by conifers at a slow rate. And then with the 1-2 of these 1919 and 1929 fires, a major landscape shift, decreases in conifer cover and increases in some of the other forest types. So major transitions in the character of this landscape over a relatively short period. And the last theme I want to end on is that of the influence of indigenous fire use in this area. We don't have a lot of data to speak to this, but there's a lot of there's a lot that our data speaks to about the importance of Native American fire use in these ecosystems. In particular, one of the things that we know about this system is that it's a lightning shadow. There's not a lot of lightning strikes on the east side of the Continental Divide. And yet what we see in our fire scar records, and other researchers have noted this as well, is a very high incidence of early, what we interpret as late spring to early summer fire scar ring positions. And this is often a pattern that's associated with human fire use in an area that is known to have both major travel corridors and major important cultural sites. This was a landscape that was lived in heavily by multiple tribes, the Blackfeet in particular, and several others. And we have good archaeological evidence of this. And what's interesting about this to me is that the story of Indigenous fire use has oftentimes come from forests like ponderosa pine forests in Western North America, where fires of frequent fire regimes are predominantly low. And the influence of added human ignitions sort of reinforces a lot of those dynamics, right? You add ignitions in, and it may decrease your fire intervals a little bit. That may have influences on the fire severity patterns, but not major ones. Largely, it reinforces the dynamic we think might have existed, at least at a large landscape scale. Well, in an ignition-limited, fire-sensitive forest like the Alberta Foothills, the impacts of added ignitions may take the landscape in a very different direction. And I think this is likely the case here. Without the influence of a human ignition source, we might have had much longer fire intervals, and the landscape condition would have really diverged, would have maybe fit the more classical lodgepole pine model. So this is a really interesting case where human ignitions can fundamentally influence a landscape in an unexpected way, at least for us. And actually in doing so has revealed some really interesting dynamics about the resilience of these ecosystems to frequent fire that we haven't documented elsewhere. So in conclusion, I think some of the major take-home points are the Alberta Foothills were dominated by a very frequent fire regime. Mixed-severity fire regimes were very prominent, especially in the montane and lower subalpine zone. We might expect transitions as we go further up in elevation. This Douglas-fir fire regime was a really interesting, really dynamic one of spatial patchiness dominated by lower to moderate severity regimes, but punctuated by high severity events at times. The lodgepole pine fire regime was also a mixed severity fire regime, but still had a really important component, a dominant component of high severity fire that resulted in very young forests across a really large expanse of area. But despite it being young, there was some interesting landscape heterogeneity and structural diversity built into these landscapes. And clearly this was a very dynamic transitory landscape that experienced quite a lot of change. I think there's some interesting work that our work highlights to be done in understanding how fires operate in these young heterogeneous environments where coarse woody debris, for instance, is patchy and not as abundant as in longer fire interval models that we tend to think about for these forests. And we didn't see what sort of the major expectation has been, which is a major sort of collapse or transition of this ecosystem under frequent fire. Instead, we saw that while some of that does occur, there are these critical transitions that occur in fire severity and fire regime and age structures at around that 50-year median fire interval mark that we really need to begin to understand better and account for. And I will finish there. We had a lot of people contribute to this, so I thank our funders and all of our collaborators, and I will leave it open to questions.
Well,